So what I want to do in the time we've got today is to talk a bit about the approach to diversity and inclusion often taken within organisations. And I work in a university setting. I teach counselling and psychotherapy at the University of Leeds. So I'm kind of involved in EDI work within the university, and that's what I want to talk about a bit. And the idea, I want to kind of talk about the differences between the usual organisational EDI approaches taken versus what I'm calling a critical diversity approach, which I think is also from what James Sedgwick was talking about earlier. I want to talk about dualisms and how to try and avoid going into dualisms and how hard that is. I then want to talk about a critique of the idea of inclusion, and then move on to say, how can we take on a critical diversity agenda within counselling and psychotherapy? What are the difficulties of doing that, and what strengths do we have to be able to do that? I want to then take a brief tangent through ableism, which I think is something we rarely talk about within the diversity agenda or within counselling and psychotherapy, and just conclude some thoughts about this. And my ideas for this paper were prompted by reading the papers, some of which are here today, some of which aren't, but will be in the special issue, and listening to other people speaking today. So I'll try and refer to those papers when they become relevant. So what I've found in the organisational approaches to equality and diversity and inclusion, it's very much about celebrating differences. Universities spend a lot of time making sure we all know about things such as Pride events and Black History Month and all these kind of things, which are like, look, we're all different people, isn't that fantastic? What a lovely diverse world we live in. And then there's also a focus on making sure we're all trained to try and not be biased and treat everybody equally or equitably. What I find to be missing is that there's no deep work whatsoever of challenging our own inevitably internalized isms, because we'll have internalized everything around us in our society. And so it's almost like, let's do this kind of superficial stuff to prove that we can treat everybody equally and prove we're not racist, for example, and then we can tick all those boxes around diversity. I find this hugely problematic, and what I think diversity work should involve is, first of all, not calling it diversity, but we won't go into that. It's more about inequalities. It's more about constant deconstruction and questioning our own assumptions and language that we're using all the time that demonstrate how we see the world and demonstrate the inequalities in our internal worlds and the external world. So I think we need to be aiming to be anti-racist rather than not racist, which means being aware of our own inevitable racism, because that's the society we live in. Similarly, anti-sexist, anti-heterosexist, anti-ableist, anti-classist, and all the others. So I'm not saying that all we need to be doing is our internal work, which is stuff we should be very familiar with as counsellors and psychotherapists, but that in doing that internal work, that gives us the tools we need to notice the inequalities in material realities in the external world. So what I find really interesting, and today I found really interesting, is how easy it is to move from critiquing the dominant discourses out there to then creating a new polarization or a new dualism. So Sedgwick earlier talked about paying, no, I think you didn't talk about it today, but it's in your paper. I've kind of read all the papers that the others of you haven't had access to, so it probably makes it a bit unfair, really. But you talked about paying more attention to material realities rather than the intrapsychic worlds of our clients, and that's what psychotherapy hasn't done. And I completely agree, that's something as a profession we've really not focused on very much at all. We're very much about internal worlds. But I worry about creating a new dualism here. You know, why should we be just looking at material realities rather than also intrapsychic ideas? So when you talk about psychological distress or microaggressions as being slight or minor injuries compared to real material things, I think this creates another dualism, and of kind of almost like saying which manifestations of oppression are more important, or creating a hierarchy of suffering. And in doing that, we're then fighting about which is worse, who's worst off. And what we're leaving completely unchallenged are the perpetrators of oppression and the systems of inequality. And I think that's really dangerous. So how can we avoid going into more dualism? So it was when Christian was talking about the vaccination stuff, how can we get away from the dualisms of this is what science means, or this is what science means, and this is what people should be allowed to do, or this is what people shouldn't be allowed to do? How can we create a kind of openness to all possibilities? Okay, that was my dualisms bit. Now I want to say a bit about, I've said a bit about a critique of diversity, because that leaves out the idea of inequalities. It suggests that we're all already equal and just equally different, which I just don't think is true. Equally problematic, I think, is the idea of inclusion, and that we should be aiming towards inclusion. And I think inclusion is very similar to the idea of assimilation, which is equally problematic. So it's about people joining in with society as it is without challenging how society is. Why would we want to be included in something which warrants critique? Why aren't we instead challenging the rules of the game? I think to ask or to argue for inclusion as a minoritized group member leaves the power relations intact and demeans the person asking, leaving the power with the people who are in the powerful majority to say, okay, you can come in as long as, or you gay person will be all right as long as you're taking relationships seriously and being married, for example. So the kind of politics of inclusion lead to almost making who's included a bit broader each time, but the conditions under which you're allowed to belong don't really change. Instead, Anita Sethi's book provides a different way of doing this, which is rather than saying, am I allowed in? Am I allowed here, please? It's saying, I belong here. That's the starting point. Okay, so my next point is to look at the critical diversity agenda in counselling and psychotherapy, and what are the difficulties for us as a profession to take this on, and what might our strengths be. I think there are three difficulties that I'm going to talk about today briefly. First of all is taking the material realities seriously. I've already mentioned that. That's something we often don't do as a profession because we're so interested in internal worlds. And we need to be really taking that as a serious part of people's experience and phenomenology. The second thing is I think we can be quite defensive as counsellors and psychotherapists about the idea of being empathic and not having to understand somebody from our own experience. So when clients say, I want a woman, says, I want a woman client, or, you know, somebody says, I want to see this particular kind of person, we can go into, oh, it's all right, all counsellors can see everybody because we can be empathic with everybody. Irving Goffman, the theorist on stigma, talked about the two groups who can help the stigmatized individuals. And he referred to them as the own and the wise. So the own are those people who share the identity and therefore know from their own experience something of how that minoritization plays out. And the wise are the group of allies, the people who are interested, who want to be standing alongside the own, but don't share that experience. And I think it's really crucial here that we acknowledge the benefits of understanding from shared experience, as well as the understanding from people who aren't part of that experience. So we don't need to be defensive about it. The third point that could be difficult for our profession in taking the critical diversity agenda seriously is what's already been referred to, let me check my notes, by somebody today. And I wrote down who it was, if I can find it. I think it was Daryl Marr. Thank you, Daryl. I'm talking about all the theories that are within our therapy profession and how culturally encapsulated they are. And so how theory of psychology and of psychotherapy reinforces the dominant discourses in our society and the inequalities that are there. Making it really clear, as they talked about in the queer needs, queer thingy one right at the beginning of the day, and my head's gone for who that was and what it was called exactly. I do apologise, please tell me afterwards. About the importance of being queer affirming, not just being non-judgmental, because we are part of a history of a profession that pathologized gay people and endorsed conversion therapy. So just being kind of on the fence about it is not enough. So those are the three things that I think are working against us. There's many different ways in which we're part of cultural movements that reinforce dominant discourses. The person who didn't manage to make it today has written a great paper about the humanitarian aid movement and how counselling and psychotherapy is involved in that, and the patronisation and colonialisation that this perpetuates that we're then still part of. There's the kind of access to work things, there's the association with psychiatry and medical movements that as counselling and psychotherapy we're intricately connected with and perpetuate a lot of cultural dominant ideas. So, however, I don't think all is lost here. I think as a profession we have a particular strength which should help us to be able to perpetuate a critical diversity agenda. And this is that what we're good at, what we should be good at in our training, is to try and make sure we're examining and deconstructing our own deeply held biases and prejudices. We're trying to understand ourselves. I think what can be missing sometimes is understanding ourselves in a cultural, political, societal context, and that's the essential bit. Who are we in our context, and how can we understand that more? And the idea that Tony was talking about, I think, from Freud, that the more we can do that internal work of accepting all parts of ourselves, the more we can accept diverse others. So I think this is an important starting point from the profession to be able to aim to go towards all our clients in all their differences, to encounter them and to meet alterity with humility. And the model for cultural responsiveness that focuses on the humility, I think, is really crucial here and really helpful. A slight tangent here, or a particular example, which is of ableism, is about how much we should be deconstructing and thinking about the language we're using all the time within counselling and psychotherapy and within diversity conversations. And I'm amazed how often dominant ways of perceiving, like sight and hearing, are conflated with awareness and therefore perpetuating the ableist assumptions about this. So today, just today, 3 times it's been used, the word blind has been used to mean unaware. And it's really challenged. Again, people say, oh, that's mad or that's crazy, and it's used to imply irrationality. It's all these kind of things implicit in our language that are used on an everyday basis that really needs to be challenged as to what they mean. Blind people are not unaware. So part of this is within every particular identity movement, it's about how to be aware of promoting the legitimacy of one group at the expense of another. So it's kind of following the ideas of inclusion and the dangers of that when we're saying, but we should be allowed in society, we're okay, we're not threatening, we're not the baddies, and kind of almost trying to convince that by saying we're normal like the rest of you in other ways. So the within the queer movement, trying to get more validity by getting marriage, which I'm not saying was a bad thing politically necessarily, but what it's led to, I think, is that now married gay people are much more accepted. And that hasn't helped at all those queer people who don't go for that kind of relationship. So what I'm arguing for, instead of trying to argue for inclusion on the basis of fitting the dominant norms, is to say that we should be deconstructing with the critical diversity agenda all the norms, all the dominant discourses. Agosto et al., who talk about how ableism was within a lot of the anti-racist discourses, talks about cripping and queering the language and the curriculum that we're talking about all the time. My final point is, how do we do any of this? How do we engage people? How do we engage counselling and psychotherapy students in thinking about the critical diversity agenda? And I've spent quite a lot of time in Leeds looking at how to do that with students and writing about that. And it's how to get past people's defences at being called racist, at saying you have prejudices and you should think about them. And of course, those accusing ways of doing that tend to provoke defence. And what I found, as Nicole's paper that I heard a bit about today, is just beautiful to read the whole thing. And it was the paper that engaged me most with thinking about diversity in this collection. And I found how powerful sharing a personal story with emotion and humility is to engage us and to think about people who are different. And that's what I found useful in terms of critical diversity in education, how to engage students. However, that's great for getting past people's defensive, but you really need to also think about how do we not exploit people in the telling of their own stories for the benefits of others. So again, those power dynamics just creep up everywhere. So my conclusion, I want us to move away from celebrating difference to the idea of critical diversity. How can we challenge all binaries, making an open space for many possibilities, challenging dominant discourses, fixed identities, deconstructing and disrupting our language and theories? And how instead can we promote a stance of acknowledging, welcoming, and seeking to learn from alterity or difference? How can we be not knowing, humble, curious, and respectful of others? How can we be responsible for extending our own knowledge of material inequalities, structural oppressions, and embodied existences, not just internal worlds, and at the same time challenging our own internalizations of normative dominant discourses? So my question is whether we can create a place for belonging in diverse ways to reclaim our lands, our world, our universe maybe, our society, and the terrain of psychotherapy for all. There's some references that I've included today in my paper. There'll be the rest of them. Stop my share, I hope.
Right. Thank you very much. And so lots of things there, and we've got about 10 minutes or so, or just under that, to have comments or thoughts, questions. So, any thoughts, questions?
I'd like to start, Gillian. Thank you so much for that. I'm so delighted, that you've stayed today and you've really listened and summed up in that way. But I wanted to ask you a question with regard to where for you does economics play in this? We've got a system of incredible exclusion happening as we talk. Yes. More and more people can't afford to eat, etc., etc. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, where does economics, capitalism? Yeah.
That's what I mean by material realities, really.
I wondered when you said reclaiming land or something. I was wondering whether you were talking about a redistribution of the land.
Probably not specifically. I guess it's about seeing land as a place where we belong or we don't belong, and reclaiming places as a place for us all to belong. But I mean, that's all sounding a bit too airy-fairy, isn't it? I think you're absolutely right, Del, that the distribution of wealth is crucial. And the inequalities in how we have lives and our opportunities is just so rife and just getting worse and worse all the time. And we can't be doing counselling without recognising and challenging that.
And yet it's hardly anywhere, is it?
No.
It's not directly in the papers today. It's not in the 99% of the literature.
No, that I was interviewed this last few weeks for a chapter on class and counselling that Claire Slane is currently editing. So I'm hoping that will be about soon. And a lot of that is about the economics of this situation. And that, of course, creates a lot of psychological distress. And we need to know our limits. Somebody said that earlier today. Psychotherapy and counselling is not the answer to a lot of these problems.
Well, the danger is it's the reverse, isn't it? It's a bandage to prevent real action happening.
Yeah, and it's how do we take responsibility from listening to the stories of distress from our clients and do something with those politically.
Gillian, I suppose my thank you for all that. It's really interesting. I suppose my fear is when we start saying this is what we should do, that we do set up this kind of Freudian superego thing that starts revolving like a wheel, and we all feel bad because we're not doing what we should be doing, and that shuts us all up, and so I suppose it's always a danger that's always there. But I was struck by one of your points where how you get through that is through a kind of humility with people. You know, that you don't punish people for having a view, you know, try to help them understand it, or, you know, stuff like that. So,
no, I totally take that on, Tony, and you're right. It's my passion when I speak sometimes comes out much more in everyone should be doing this, but it's kind of not how I mean it to come over. It's more like, you know, if you believe this, then maybe it will be good to, you know, but there's something about how to communicate that, you're right, and it's how to communicate that in a way that opens people up to possibilities rather than shuts down and promoting defences.
Sometimes I think it seems impossible, you know, so apart from maybe through humor, maybe, or definitely some kind of humility.
I think it's really, really, really hard, but I think if we conclude that it's impossible and give up, it just means that it gets worse, you know, so we've got to keep going.
No, that's not a conclusion.
Yeah.
Gillian, thank you. I just wanted to say that we should be doing it, and we should continue to be doing it, basically on many different levels. I mean, I haven't participated all day today, but given what I've heard, and given how the system is so constructed in a certain way to restrict any other alternative voices of the dissenter, as Anthony said earlier on, what space can there be to acknowledge and work with accepting difference within the structures that we have at this moment in time? You know, it's a real, you know, and unless these programs, unless what we teach, unless what's taught and what we inherit ultimately in terms of the byproducts of all of that is reconstructed fundamentally, and there's acceptance by all of us in many ways around working towards that, what else am I left with? So it's really critical that we must have a critical voice, I suppose, and a critical lens through which we are confronted and meet these challenges in different ways.
Absolutely, and use whatever tools we have to do that, to critique. It's like silence is not an option, is it, really, with all the stuff that's going on?
Well, we are coming up to past, where we're going to go into small groups. But I wonder, are there any more sort of thoughts, comments?
Can I just apologise for not being able to keep going for the plenary? So if anybody else has got anything to say to me specifically, can you do that now, please?
I suppose I did have a question. I'm trying to think how to put this into words. The position that you've advocated would entail most practitioners going beyond what you would call a position of openness and tolerance into accepting certain political positions on certain political issues. And I wondered what you thought about the possibility that certain practitioners would no longer be able to carry on in the profession, for example, if they didn't hold to those particular positions.
For me, I don't think acceptance of people's rights to make their own decisions to live how they live in the world is about agreement. So I don't quite get how that would make it impossible for people to practice.
Well, I suppose if you thought, I know it's been much more of a live issue in the United States than here for cultural reasons, but for example, there's sort of an unresolved tension between how do practitioners of a religious faith, for example, have to sit in a profession which endorses an affirmative approach to LGBT clients when their faith perhaps rules that out as a position.
I guess it's the tension I was talking about before in terms of people's autonomous right to be who they want to be, along with looking at the impact of how they are on everybody else. And I think if how you choose to be in the world is a way that doesn't accept other people's right to choose how they are, I think it's seriously dubious whether you can be a therapist who's trying to be working with acceptance of people.
Well, I think that's a clear answer. Thank you.
There's also an answer, I don't know if it is the answer, that one should really think of eventually privileging heteronomy over autonomy.
I guess it's where individuals' rights stop for me, it's when it's harming other people.
Well, you know, maybe that's a good place to leave it, actually. So thank you very much, Gillian. And I'm sure there's a lot more that we could discuss, but I think it's time for the small groups.